cheating millionaire runs into his ex-pregnant wife, but seeing the kids beside her leaves him. High-rise apartments, designer suits, and an empire built on ambition, Leonard Chambers had it all, or so it seemed. The self-made millionaire glided through Manhattan's elite circles with a gleaming smile that masked the secrets of a crumbling marriage. By the time the tabloids uncovered his affair, it was too late. His wife of 10 years, Sarah, walked out the door, two little hands clinging to hers and heartbreak tightening her chest. Now, years later, a chance encounter on a bustling city street threatens to unravel Leonard's carefully curated new life. Because beside Sarah stand the children he abandoned, and in an instant his world tilts on its axis. Leonard Chambers was born into a working-class family on the outskirts of Chicago. His father, Jonathan Chambers, drove a city bus, and his mother, Irene, worked as a seamstress in a small garment factory. They struggled to make ends meet, but they did everything possible to support Leonard's voracious curiosity. By his teens, he exhibited an uncanny knack for numbers and an almost obsessive interest in technology. He devoured business books from the local library, studying the strategies of titans like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. After earning a scholarship to Northwestern University, Leonard's path to success accelerated. He majored in finance, then forged key connections at every internship. One summer, he landed a spot at Friedman and Friedman Associates, a respected venture capital firm run by the sagacious Donald Friedman and his daughter, Lisa Friedman. They became mentors to Leonard, spotting in him a rare blend of analytical brilliance and unrelenting drive. By the time he graduated, Friedman and Friedman offered him a role in their expanding Manhattan office. It was in New York that Leonard's fortunes soared. He identified emerging tech startups and convinced Friedman and Friedman to invest. Each success gilded his reputation. By age 30, he was heading up a new division, traveling globally to assess potential acquisitions. His bank account ballooned, and with it came a penthouse apartment in Midtown, the sleek suits, and a growing appetite for recognition among the city's elite. Amid these heady years, Leonard met Sarah Henderson. She was a freelance graphic designer working at a conference Friedman and Friedman organized. Sarah's quiet warmth contrasted sharply with the brash New York hustle. He courted her with lavish dinners, promising her a future free of the financial woes that had dogged his own parents. Sarah, initially wary, found herself enthralled by his intellect and devotion. They married in a well-publicized ceremony at the Astoria Grand Hotel. The Friedmans, along with Mark Cuban and a slew of other influential figures, attended. Photos from the glamorous event circulated in business magazines and society pages, painting Leonard and Sarah as a golden couple, beauty, wealth, and unstoppable ambition. Yet cracks formed beneath the glossy surface. As Friedman and Friedman soared on Leonard's deals, so did his workload and his ego. He worked late nights, traveled constantly, and entertained a parade of potential clients or co-investors in exclusive clubs. The once deep conversations with Sarah were replaced by fleeting chats over rushed breakfasts. She felt him slipping away, and he seemed increasingly distant. Two children, Sophie and Brandon, were born into an environment of partial togetherness, with a father who showered them with gifts, but struggled to give them time. When rumors of Leonard's affair began circulating, many brushed it off as typical tabloid fodder. Sarah, though, had caught the clues: whispered phone calls, suspicious business trips, and endless client dinners. Confronting him led to explosive arguments, culminating in the stark realization that the life they built was as precarious as a house of cards. Sarah demanded honesty, and Leonard gave a half-hearted confession that broke them both. The divorce proceedings made headlines. Friedman and Friedman discreetly distanced themselves from the scandal. Sarah withdrew from public life to shield Sophie and Brandon from the glare of paparazzi, and Leonard, though regretful, seemed more concerned about preserving his deals and his image. Amid the swirl of accusations, heartbreak, and legal battles, Sarah packed her bags, took the children, and left New York for a quieter existence back in her hometown near Boston. Leonard rarely saw them, funneling child support payments through attorneys and burying himself deeper in business pursuits, determined to rebound from personal disaster. Once the divorce was final, Sarah Henderson no longer Chambers tried to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. She returned to Boston, where her grandmother's old house stood in a tree-lined suburban neighborhood. Although it required some work, the cozy space offered a refuge for her and the kids. Gone were the days of penthouse views and catered brunches. Instead, Sarah took solace in simple routines, morning walks with Sophie and Brandon, arts and crafts sessions in the small living room, and quiet dinners that ended with bedtime stories. Financially, she was stable thanks to the divorce settlement and Leonard's child support, but Sarah refused to live idly on that money alone. She resurrected her freelance design career, working from a sunlit nook in the house. Over time, she cultivated a respectable list of clients, some from her old NYC connections and a growing number from local businesses. The steady stream of work kept her mind occupied, an antidote to memories of heartbreak. Sophie, 8, and Brandon, 6, adapted to their new environment with surprising resilience. Sophie inherited her mother's artistic inclination, often sketching elaborate pictures of their old apartment or dreamlike cityscapes. Brandon, more reserved, clung to stuffed animals and bedtime routines for comfort, occasionally asking, "When will Daddy visit?" Sarah would muster a gentle smile, explaining that Leonard's work was complicated, but he loved them. It was the best she could do to maintain a positive image of their father, even though a part of her still seethed at his betrayal. Leonard, on the other hand, made occasional efforts to contact the kids, calls that often ended awkwardly. He'd promised to visit soon or send them a new gadget, but the visits never quite materialized. Business obligations, he insisted, always arose at the last minute. Friedman and Friedman had recovered from the scandal, partly by diminishing Leonard's role in public events. Nonetheless, they valued his strategic mind enough to keep him on. Leonard poured himself into acquisitions, forging new alliances and launching side ventures, trying to recast his personal brand as a dynamic but solitary mogul. The affair that wrecked his marriage fizzled quickly. The woman, a marketing executive named Marina Blake, wasn't keen on being associated with the fallout. She parted ways with Leonard soon after the divorce, leaving him with a bruised ego and a deep sense of regret he refused to fully acknowledge. Instead, he sought validation in high-stakes deals and lavish parties. Loneliness crept in, but he buried it under layers of rationalization. "I have no time for emotional entanglements." Behind the scenes, Friedman and Friedman quietly introduced new rising stars, like Anthony Delgado, a sharp-witted analyst who began overshadowing Leonard. Whispers circulated that Leonard's best days might be behind him, yet outwardly he maintained the facade of unshakable success. He doubled down on philanthropic events, sometimes appearing at black-tie galas where he'd donate large sums to children's charities, ironically claiming an interest in supporting families in need. Back in Boston, Sarah caught snippets of his doings in business magazines. She rarely let them bother her. Her life now revolved around the kids, her work, and a budding sense of peace she was determined to protect. The last thing she expected was for their paths to cross again, especially not in a way that would test her resolve to move forward and Leonard's long-repressed remorse. One crisp autumn weekend, Sarah decided it was time for a small getaway. Sophie and Brandon had been clamoring for a trip somewhere exciting. Sarah's friend, Carrie Martin, who lived in New York City's Upper West Side, invited them to visit and take advantage of the city's cultural offerings. Carrie had a daughter, Fiona, close in age to Sophie. They could spend a couple of days exploring museums, visiting Central Park, and watching a Broadway matinee. Sarah hesitated at first. New York was the city of her broken marriage, and the place she'd fled to rebuild her life. But she also knew she couldn't shield the kids from the city forever, nor from the world associated with their father. So she accepted Carrie's invitation and planned a family-friendly itinerary, hoping to avoid any old haunts that might stir painful memories. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the city's hustle instantly reminding Sarah of what she had once lived among: the endless traffic, the towering skyscrapers, the swirling blend of languages on every street corner. Sophie gaped at the buildings with wide-eyed curiosity, while Brandon held Sarah's hand tightly, as though the bustling crowds made him nervous. Carrie's apartment offered a warm welcome, a swirl of laughter, and immediate chatter about the weekend plans. Saturday morning dawned bright, and they headed off to the American Museum of Natural History, the kids enchanted by dinosaur skeletons and sparkling gem exhibits. By midday, everyone was starving, so they strolled to a nearby burger place that Carrie swore was the best in Manhattan. Inside the crowded restaurant, Sarah scanned for an available table. Carrie spotted a small booth in the corner. As Sarah guided Sophie and Brandon through the throng of diners, her gaze snagged on a familiar profile across the room. Seated at a table near the window was Leonard Chambers, in a crisp jacket, a tablet on the table, probably scanning market reports or a pitch deck. The shock reverberated through Sarah's body like a jolt of electricity. She froze. Her mind raced with questions. What is he doing here? Should I turn around? Will he see us? But it was too late. Leonard looked up from his tablet, and their eyes locked. His expression went from neutral to stunned in a heartbeat. The restaurant seemed to quiet, or perhaps it was only in Sarah's mind. She felt Carrie's hand on her arm, a silent gesture of support. Sophie and Brandon, oblivious, craned their necks to see what had caused their mom to stop abruptly. Then they recognized their father, the man they'd barely glimpsed in person for years, only in photos or on rare video calls. Leonard stood, nearly knocking his coffee mug over. He took a step forward, mouth slightly agape, as if words were failing him. It felt as though time stretched painfully. Sarah's protective instincts flared. She braced herself, uncertain how this moment would unfold. All she knew was that the life she had so carefully rebuilt was colliding with the life she had left behind, and the two innocent children by her side were about to see their father in the flesh, likely for the first time since they were toddlers. Sophie's face lit up with recognition, her eyes darting between Sarah and Leonard. Brandon clutched Sarah's hand so tightly it hurt, his little body trembling with confusion rather than joy. Sarah found herself struggling to breathe, her heart pounding in her ears. Every rational part of her wanted to whisk her children out of the restaurant before old wounds reopened, but a stronger, calmer voice within whispered, they deserve to see him. This is their father, after all. Leonard's gaze flickered to the kids, and in that instant, the self-assured millionaire seemed to crumble from within. His eyes welled up as he noticed how much they had grown, the unmistakable resemblance they shared with him. Sophie, tall and poised, and Brandon, smaller but with the same determined set to his jaw that Leonard once saw in the mirror. Emotions he had long buried forced their way to the surface. Sarah steadied herself. She cleared her throat, forcing her voice to remain composed. "Leonard," she said simply, "it's been a while." He blinked, struggling to form words. Yes, it has." He tore his gaze from Sarah to focus on Sophie and Brandon. "Hi, kids. he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Sophie, ever the inquisitive one, opened her mouth first. Dad? Mom said you live in New York. Why didn't you ever visit us? The question hung in the air, laden with the innocence of childhood cutting straight to the core of adult failings. Leonard stammered. I wanted to. Things were complicated. He glanced at Sarah, as if searching for a lifeline. But she wouldn't rescue him from the truth he had to face. The awkward silence was broken by Carrie, who gently suggested they combine tables if everyone was comfortable. Sarah looked at her children, reading the flicker of curiosity and longing in their eyes. Against every protective instinct, she nodded. Maybe it's time they have a chance to talk, no matter how brief and painful. They pushed 2 tables together. Leonard, flustered, sat across from Sophie and Brandon. Sarah slid in next to Carrie at a slight distance, ready to intervene if the conversation went south. Brandon, too shy to speak at first, studied Leonard's face intently. Sarah guessed he was trying to match the real man to the photos he'd glimpsed in old albums. Leonard cleared his throat. How are you both? You must be 8 and 6 now, right? He tried to smile, though it wavered. Sophie nodded. I'm 8. Brandon is 6. I'm in 3rd grade, and Brandon's in 1st. She fiddled with a napkin, her bright eyes searching her father's face. What do you do now, Dad? Mom said you work in business. Yes, I'm still working with Friedman and Friedman. 1. Invest in companies. Leonard swallowed, unsure how to condense his elaborate job into child-friendly terms. A waitress appeared, sensing the heavy atmosphere. She took orders quickly. While the group waited for their food, the conversation limped along, peppered with stilted questions from the children, halting answers from Leonard, and watchful silence from Sarah. She couldn't ignore the flicker of regret in his eyes, nor could she deny the longing in Sophie's voice as she tried to connect with the father she never truly knew. Lunch progressed in a surreal haze. Carrie did her best to steer conversation to lighter topics, favorite school subjects, funny stories about her daughter Fiona, but the tension at the table was palpable. Leonard tried to appear calm, but he was drowning in a swirl of guilt and memories. He recalled Sophie's infancy, reading finance articles at 2 a.m. while rocking her bassinet. He remembered Brandon's birth, overshadowed by a tense business negotiation. Everything he had missed since was now painted in stark reality before him. Sarah kept her responses polite but reserved. She allowed the children to speak openly with Leonard, to ask him about his life, but she guarded her heart. A part of her still smarted from the betrayal and emptiness of their final months as a couple. Yet seeing Leonard so raw, eyes misting over whenever Sophie or Brandon laughed, stirred complicated feelings she had spent years suppressing. The kids, for their part, hovered between curiosity and wariness. Brandon eyed his father like a puzzle he couldn't solve, occasionally venturing a quiet word about his favorite books or the new puppy they got 6 months ago. Sophie was more forthright, pressing Leonard with questions about his job, where he lived, and if he was married now. Leonard found himself stumbling through disclaimers that it's just me and that he hasn't settled down again. Each question felt like a small spotlight on the chasm between him and the family he once had. After the plates were cleared, the waitress offered dessert menus. Carrie suggested ice cream sundaes for the kids. Leonard insisted on paying the bill, though Sarah quickly shook her head. We can split it, she said tersely, remembering how finances became a weapon at the end of their marriage. But Leonard insisted, quietly acknowledging it as the least he could do. When the check was settled, Carrie took it upon herself to escort the children outside for a brief stroll. Giving Leonard and Sarah a moment, she offered Sarah a meaningful look. Now's your chance to talk if you want. Sarah exhaled shakily as Carrie departed with Sophie and Brandon in tow, leaving her and Leonard alone in the bustling restaurant. Leonard leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low. Thank you for letting me see them, he began. I didn't know how much I missed until just now. Sarah struggled to keep her composure, the swirl of old anger and fresh heartbreak pulsing in her veins. You're their father. I'm not going to stand in their way of knowing you, she said, trying to sound calm. But it's not that simple. They've spent years wondering if you'd show up. Leonard's shoulders slumped. I know. I'm sorry. I was so focused on my business. After everything that happened, I convinced myself that you were better off without me. Sarah's eyes flashed. That's not for you to decide. You had responsibilities. Our divorce was ugly, but the kids had nothing to do with that. You needed to be in their lives. He nodded, eyes brimming. I'm asking you now, can I see them again, properly? I want to try. Please, Sarah. She inhaled deeply. The old reflex told her to shield her heart, to say no. But the mother in her recognized that Sophie and Brandon had a right to their father if he was sincere this time. I'll think about it, she said quietly. This can't be a one-off thing. If you come back into their lives, you have to be consistent. Leonard reached for her hand, but she pulled away. He murmured, I understand. I promise I'll do better. Sarah rose, purse in hand. Her heart felt like it was caught in a vise. I hope so, she whispered, before stepping outside into the bright autumn sun, leaving Leonard behind with a swirl of regret and determination. The next chapter of their story would hinge on whether he could truly change, or if his old habits would tear open wounds that were only beginning to heal. Back at Carrie's apartment, Sarah settled onto the living room couch, releasing a long, exhausted sigh. The kids were sprawled on the floor with Fiona, coloring pictures of city skylines. Carrie offered Sarah a cup of tea and arched an eyebrow expectantly. How do you feel? She asked, softly, voice laced with concern. Sarah stared into her mug. Conflicted, she admitted. Leonard says he wants to be part of their lives again, but after all the broken promises. She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the jumble of emotions. Carrie nodded. You have every right to be cautious. The kids deserve a father who shows up, not one who disappears. But maybe he's changed. Sarah shrugged. She remembered the rawness in Leonard's eyes, how he seemed genuinely shaken by seeing Sophie and Brandon. Part of her wanted to believe he could atone, especially for the children's sake. Yet fear coiled in her chest at the thought of letting him in again, only to watch him vanish under the weight of business deals or a new fling. That night, as Sarah tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter asked the question Sarah had been dreading. Mom, is Dad going to visit us in Boston? Sarah hesitated. He might, she replied, gently brushing Sophie's hair, but nothing is decided yet. Sophie looked hopeful, which tightened Sarah's resolve not to let Leonard break her child's heart again. Meanwhile, Leonard returned to his penthouse, a space that felt emptier than ever. The panoramic windows showcased the sparkling Manhattan skyline, once a symbol of his success. Now, it reminded him of how far he'd strayed from the family he'd built. He slumped onto a leather couch, ignoring the persistent notifications on his phone. Business deals seemed trivial compared to the conversation he'd just had with Sarah. In the quiet, he felt the full weight of his mistakes pressing in on him. He thought about how he might reconnect with Sophie and Brandon. Should he plan a trip to Boston? Invite them to Manhattan for a weekend? Could they handle the pace of his life here? Or would it be better to start small, maybe a day at a museum or a park? His mind buzzed with possibilities. Beneath it all, he feared Sarah might never trust him, and who could blame her? The next day, Leonard reached out to an old friend, Dr. Andrea Palmer, who had once given him advice when he and Sarah were on the brink of divorce. Andrea was a family therapist who understood the delicate process of rebuilding relationships with children. You need to show consistency, she told Leonard over the phone. Children thrive on routine and predictability. Grand gestures won't fix the past. It's your day-to-day effort that matters. He took notes, determined to do things right this time. Days turned into weeks, and Leonard made tentative calls to Sarah, discussing potential visits. She set boundaries: no last-minute cancellations, no extravagant promises, just steady, reliable contact. For the first time, Leonard found himself reorganizing his business commitments around fatherhood rather than the other way around. Still, doubts gnawed at Sarah. She could see how the kids' excitement grew whenever Leonard's name surfaced. Sophie wrote him letters, while Brandon quietly set aside artwork to show Dad. Sarah prayed Leonard wouldn't fold when deals heated up or his social circle beckoned, because if he did, she wasn't sure her children's hearts, or her own, could bear the disappointment. Over the next month, Sarah and Leonard arranged a visit at a quiet park near Boston. They chose a Saturday afternoon with mild weather, a neutral territory where the kids could feel safe and free to roam without the city's overstimulation. Sarah arrived first with Sophie and Brandon, claiming a picnic table under a big oak tree. She felt butterflies in her stomach, bracing herself for the possibility that Leonard might back out. But he didn't. Clad in casual jeans and a button-down shirt, Leonard appeared, holding a small bouquet of sunflowers, Sarah's favorite from years past. Hesitation flickered across her face, but she accepted them with a polite nod, setting them aside on the bench. Meanwhile, the kids rushed forward, excitement overriding any lingering tension. Leonard crouched down to greet them, arms open in a cautious invitation. Sophie hugged him without hesitation, her small frame gripping tight. Brandon hovered for a moment, then inched closer, allowing Leonard to gently ruffle his hair. There was no dramatic outpouring of tears or confessions, just a quiet, tender moment of reconnection. They began the afternoon with a simple game of catch. Leonard tossed a baseball to Brandon, encouraging him to throw it back. Sophie occasionally chimed in, giggling when the ball veered off course. Sarah sat on the bench, arms folded, watching carefully. She felt an odd mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that Leonard had shown up, heartbreak that such an ordinary family moment felt so extraordinary because of the lost years. They snacked on sandwiches and lemonade. Leonard asked the kids about school, their favorite cartoons, and their new puppy, Rusty. Sophie pulled out a small notebook where she'd written questions for him. What's your favorite color now? Do you still have that big piano in your apartment? When's your birthday again? Each query was innocent, each answer a thread that might bridge the gap between them. Brandon showed him a drawing of a rocket ship, explaining how he wanted to be an astronaut. Leonard marveled at the detail, praising the artistry. At one point, Sarah slipped away to throw out some trash, giving father and children a chance to talk alone. Leonard, noticing her absence, lowered his voice. "You know, I'm really happy to see you too," he told them. "I'm sorry I wasn't around much before." Sophie stared at him intently, as if deciding whether to trust him, while Brandon simply nodded, fiddling with the edge of the picnic table. When Sarah returned, Leonard asked if they could take a family photo. She hesitated but agreed for the kids' sake. He snapped a selfie, Sophie on his left, Brandon on his right, and Sarah slightly behind them, an uneasy half-smile on her face. The moment felt both fragile and hopeful. By late afternoon, it was time to head home. Leonard walked them to their car, lingering as if reluctant to let them go. He extracted a promise from Sarah that they'd do this again soon. "Call me, and we'll set something up," she replied quietly. "But keep your schedule free. Don't disappoint them." Leonard nodded, solemn. "I won't," he vowed. As Sarah drove away, Sophie and Brandon waved through the back window. Leonard stood there, sunflowers still in hand, feeling like he had just taken the first genuine step toward atonement. But whether he could sustain it in the face of life's pressures, remained an open question. Despite Leonard's newfound resolve to be a consistent father, the demands of his corporate world did not relent. Friedman and Friedman Associates was in the midst of orchestrating a high-stakes merger between two prominent tech firms. Donald and Lisa Friedman leaned heavily on Leonard's expertise, and Anthony Delgado, Leonard's rising star colleague, vied for leadership in the negotiations. Tensions soared as each executive tried to outmaneuver the other in securing credit for the potential billion-dollar deal. Leonard found himself working late nights again, attending clandestine dinners with anxious CEOs, and fielding calls across multiple time zones. The old adrenaline rush beckoned him, whispering that this was where he truly thrived. Yet a new voice inside him, one shaped by his reconnection with his children, insisted he keep his weekends free to preserve time for Sophie and Brandon. One Thursday evening, as the clock neared midnight, Leonard glanced at his phone and saw a text from Sarah. "Sophie is excited about Saturday's museum visit. Don't forget." He felt a wave of guilt. The Friedmans had scheduled an emergency meeting for Saturday morning to finalize the merger plan. Anthony Delgado had strongly hinted that skipping such a meeting would jeopardize Leonard's standing within the firm. Yet cancelling on Sophie felt unthinkable. He fired off a reply to Sarah, "I'll be there." Then he braced himself for the fallout at Friedman and Friedman. The next day, Leonard informed Donald Friedman he wouldn't attend Saturday's session. Donald's brow furrowed in disapproval. "Are you sure you want to hand Delgado an opportunity to take the lead?" The warning was clear. Leonard might lose his edge. But for once, Leonard dug in. "I have family commitments," he said, voice firm. "I can catch up on Sunday." When Anthony Delgado heard the news, he smirked. "Need me to cover for you again, Chambers?" he teased, half friendly, half predatory. Leonard nodded politely, refusing to be baited. The tension in the room was thick. Friedman and Friedman had historically valued unwavering devotion. By prioritizing his children, Leonard sensed he was placing his career on shakier ground. Meanwhile, Sarah was unaware of the corporate drama swirling around Leonard's new fatherly vow. She busied herself planning the museum trip, picking out interactive exhibits for Brandon and an art gallery for Sophie's budding interest. Her skepticism lingered. Would Leonard really show up? She'd seen him break promises too many times, but this time felt different, somehow. Saturday morning, Leonard stood at Sarah's doorstep in Boston. A mild tension hung between them, but Sophie and Brandon leaped with excitement at his arrival. They piled into her car and drove downtown, where the Children's Museum offered hands-on science activities and imaginative play areas. Leonard dove into the experience, guiding Brandon through a robotics exhibit and cheering as Sophie tried a puzzle challenge. He even took pictures for them to show friends at school. Sarah observed from a slight distance. She saw how genuine Leonard's smiles were, how he crouched down to speak to the kids at eye level, something he rarely did before. It stirred a complicated blend of relief and guarded hope in her chest. Maybe he was truly changing. But the corporate world does not pause for weekend museum outings. Even as Leonard helped Sophie press her hand into a clay mold, his phone buzzed. Messages from Anthony Delgado popped up, referencing an urgent development in the merger talks. Leonard silenced the phone quickly, ignoring the slight pang of dread. If he was to keep his promise to the kids, he needed to be fully present. Yet somewhere in the background, the cost of defying Friedman and Friedman's demands was accumulating, waiting to test his resolve. The museum visit was a triumph for the children. Sophie came home beaming, clutching a pamphlet about future science workshops, and Brandon excitedly recounted every exhibit to his teddy bear. Leonard lingered in the driveway, reluctant to say goodbye. Eventually, Sarah emerged from the house, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. She invited him inside for a quick coffee, an unexpected courtesy. Inside, the living room radiated warmth, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of Leonard's penthouse. Toys lay scattered around, evidence of the kids' interests. Artwork by Sophie hung on the walls, while Brandon's toy cars lined the shelf. Leonard's gaze drifted over these details, his throat constricting at the reminder of what he'd missed. Sarah handed him a mug of coffee, then sat across from him, the tension evident in her posture. "So, you keep showing up," she observed quietly. "I'm surprised, honestly. The old Leonard would have cancelled 5 times by now." He took a sip, steeling himself. "I know I've been unreliable in the past. I'm trying to change that, not just for them, but for myself too. I owe them, and you better." She let his words settle. "They've noticed. Sophie especially is starting to trust that you might stick around. I'm cautious, but I can see you're making an effort. So, thank you." A small smile flickered across Leonard's face, tinged with sadness. "I appreciate that. I just want a chance to be a father, even if it's late." Silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "You know, they're at ages where they crave stability. I can't have you sweeping in with big gestures, only to vanish the moment your phone calls. You have to put them first sometimes." He nodded. "I'm trying. Work's complicated, but I'm drawing boundaries." For a moment, he thought of telling her about the Friedman and Friedman tensions, how Delgado threatened to overshadow him, how the merger was at a critical juncture, but that felt like an excuse. Instead, he promised, "I'll do better." "That's all I can say." "All right," Sarah breathed, uncertain but calmer. "We'll see." Just then, Brandon trotted into the room, a small doodle in his hand. "Dad, I drew you and me in a spaceship," he announced proudly. Leonard knelt, accepting the paper. The image was simple, 2 figures in a rocket, labeled Dad and Brandon. Leonard blinked back tears. "Thank you, buddy. I love it." The moment reaffirmed everything, the fatherhood he'd neglected, the future he might still salvage. But his phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with Delgado's name. He let it go to voicemail, forcing a steadiness in his voice. "I'm here right now," he told himself, "and that's what matters most." After finishing his coffee, Leonard said his goodbyes. As he drove back to Manhattan, heart brimming with cautious optimism, a creeping sense of foreboding took hold. Friedman and Friedman was no place for half measures, and ignoring urgent calls was bound to come at a price. The life he was trying to rebuild with his children might soon clash head-on with the ruthless demands of his corporate empire. Sunday morning arrived with a barrage of messages from Friedman and Friedman. Leonard had barely slept, anticipating the fallout from missing Saturday's meeting. He scrolled through his phone, 6 frantic texts from Anthony Delgado, a pointed email from Lisa Friedman, implying his absence left a bad impression on the potential partners, and a curt note from Donald Friedman requesting an urgent meeting Monday at 7 a.m. "Monsieur," he tried to quell the anxiety, reminding himself of his priorities. But Friedman and Friedman was more than just a job, it was the bedrock of his wealth and reputation. If he lost their confidence, he'd face an uphill battle, forging new alliances in the cutthroat investment world. Arriving at the office early Monday, Leonard found Delgado already seated outside Donald's corner suite. Delgado wore a smug expression. "Rough weekend, Chambers?" he inquired casually, an undercurrent of challenge in his voice. Leonard ignored him, stepping inside when Donald summoned him. Donald Friedman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, didn't mince words. He laid out the scenario. The prospective merger was on shaky ground. The other side had balked at last-minute changes, and Delgado had stepped in to salvage discussions. Lisa Friedman added that the firm needed a leader who could dedicate themselves fully. not someone distracted by personal matters. Leonard felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain composed. "I understand," he said evenly. "But as I mentioned, I had a family obligation. I'm still fully committed to Friedman and Friedman." Donald's gaze narrowed. "I'm not interested in excuses. If you want to remain at the helm of these deals, prove it. We have a final negotiation round in Hong Kong next week. Delgado is set to handle it, unless you can assure me you're up to it. This trip could be a month or more. Are you ready to commit, or should we hand the reins to Delgado for good?" "A month." The words struck Leonard like a blow. He thought of Sophie and Brandon, how they'd begun trusting him again, how Brandon had drawn that rocket, how Sophie had excitedly made plans for another museum day. Could he vanish overseas for weeks, now that he'd only just started rebuilding their bond? Lisa Friedman added, "We're not heartless, Leonard, but we need to close this. The window is tight. If your personal situation prevents your involvement, we'll respect that, but we can't keep your position of influence open indefinitely." Leonard felt torn in two. There was a time when he would have jumped at such an opportunity, hopped on the plane, hammered out the deal, and returned triumphant. But now the stakes had changed. Family no longer felt optional. He asked for a day to think it over. Donald nodded curtly, dismissing him. Delgado smirked as Leonard walked past, whispering, "Let me know if you need me to babysit your job while you babysit the kiddos." Leonard seethed, but refused to rise to the bait. In his office, he closed the door and collapsed into his chair, head in his hands. This was the test, the corporate empire versus the family he had rediscovered. He had no easy answers, but time was short, and whichever path he chose, something precious would be sacrificed. That evening, Leonard drove to Boston unannounced, his mind tangled in knots. He needed clarity, and seeing his children felt like the only way to find it. Under the glow of streetlights, he parked outside Sarah's house. Unsure if she'd welcome him, he rang the doorbell. Sarah answered, surprise flashing in her eyes. She stepped outside, quietly closing the door so the kids wouldn't be disturbed. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Leonard saw her worry and realized he hadn't even told her he was coming. "I'm sorry for showing up. I needed to talk," he sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "My firm wants me to go to Hong Kong for a major deal. It could be weeks, maybe a month or more. If I do it, I'll secure my position, but I'll lose momentum with Sophie and Brandon. If I don't, I might lose my standing at Friedman and Friedman." Sarah folded her arms. "Sounds like you've got a tough decision. What do you want me to say?" Leonard searched her face. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I just needed someone to hear me out. I don't want to disappear on the kids again. But my entire career, my identity, really is tied up in that job." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Your identity is more than a job, Leonard. You used to talk about providing for your family, building something stable. But in the end, the job took over your life. Now you're standing at another crossroads. If you want to be a father, you have to be present, not just a checkbook or a Skype call." He closed his eyes, remembering the day he moved out of this marriage, telling himself the kids would be better off once he earned enough. But that day never really came. There was always more work, more deals, more money to chase. "I don't want to lose them again," he murmured. Sarah shook her head. "That's your choice. It's always been your choice." They stood in silence, each weighed down by the ghosts of their past. Eventually, Sarah stepped back. "They're asleep now, but if you want to see them in the morning, you can crash on the couch. There's a spare blanket in the closet." Gratitude welled in Leonard's chest, though he could see the wariness still in her eyes. He nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, stepping inside. The living room was dim, lit by a small lamp. He sank onto the couch, exhaustion overtaking him. The rest of the night was a restless blur of half-dreams, visions of boardrooms in Hong Kong, the kids in a park, Delgado claiming victory, Sarah's face etched with disappointment. At dawn, Brandon woke first, sneaking into the living room. Seeing his dad on the couch, he squealed with delight, hopping onto Leonard's stomach with childlike exuberance. Leonard, jolted awake, realized this was a precious moment he could never replicate over a transcontinental conference call. The job or the family, this fork in the road demanded a decision, and his heart already knew the answer. By mid-morning, Leonard made his call. He dialed Donald Friedman, heart pounding. Lisa Friedman and Anthony Delgado were likely in the room, waiting for his decision. Steadying himself, Leonard announced, "I'm not going to Hong Kong." A silence stretched. Then Donald Friedman's voice, cooler than usual, replied, "You understand what that means?" Leonard inhaled. "Yes. I respect that the firm needs someone fully committed. If that can't be me right now, I'll accept the consequences." Another pause. "Then I suppose Delgado will take the lead. We'll discuss your future with Friedman and Friedman once the deal closes." "Good day, Leonard." The line went dead. Leonard's chest felt tight, but also oddly relieved. He wasn't certain if he'd be fired or relegated to a lesser role, but for once, he knew he'd chosen family over ambition. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing lunch for Sophie and Brandon. She studied his face. "Well," he exhaled, "I'm not going. Delgado can handle it. I'm staying here, or at least stateside, for my kids." A swirl of emotions flickered across Sarah's expression: relief, disbelief, something akin to respect. She nodded, turning back to stir a pot of soup, not pressing further. Over lunch, Sophie chatted about an upcoming school play. Brandon asked if Leonard would come watch. Leonard didn't hesitate. "I'll be there, buddy." The children's faces lit up, as though a small piece of normalcy was returning to their lives. That afternoon, Leonard took the kids to the backyard, rummaging through a box of sports gear Sarah kept. They found an old soccer ball, and Leonard taught them a few dribbling moves. He felt the crisp autumn air on his cheeks, heard the children's laughter echo in the yard. With every kick, every grin, he sensed a deeper bond forming, an invisible tether that told him this was right. As the sun sank low, painting the sky with orange and pink hues, Leonard realized it was time to head back to Manhattan and face the professional fallout. He knelt before Sophie and Brandon, hugging them tightly. "I'll call tomorrow. Maybe we can plan another weekend visit soon, okay?" Sophie nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Brandon clung to Leonard's neck, refusing to let go, until Sarah gently coaxed him away. "Say bye to Dad," she whispered. "He'll come back." Leonard rose, wiping his eyes discreetly. He turned to Sarah. "Thank you for letting me stay. I know this is all complicated." She inclined her head. "They need a father. Just don't break their hearts again." He swallowed hard, voice thick. "I promise I won't." As he drove away, Leonard's eyes blurred with tears. He recalled the day he left Sarah in that penthouse, convinced the world of high finance demanded his all. Now, he was discovering that losing everything to gain a moment with his kids might be the best trade he'd ever make. The road ahead loomed uncertain. He didn't know how Friedman and Friedman would react, or if Delgado would sabotage his future. But for the first time in a long while, Leonard felt he was doing the right thing, and that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, Friedman and Friedman announced that Anthony Delgado successfully closed the Hong Kong merger. When Leonard returned to the Manhattan office, he was quietly informed that his role would shift away from high-profile acquisitions. Instead, he'd serve as a senior consultant, a position that carried less prestige but allowed him more flexibility. While Donald Friedman didn't outright fire him, The message was clear. Leonard's star power within the firm had dimmed. Surprisingly, Leonard found himself at peace with the demotion. Without the unyielding pressure of top deals, he could spend more time traveling to Boston, attending Sophie's school recitals, and coaching Brandon's fledgling soccer interests. Friedman and Friedman's new arrangement, while humbling, granted him the life he now realized he wanted: fatherhood before fortune. He also enrolled in counseling sessions with Dr. Andrea Palmer, focusing on bridging emotional gaps with his children and dealing with the lingering guilt over how he had treated Sarah. He learned that redemption wasn't a single grand gesture, but a series of daily commitments: showing up, listening, and apologizing when necessary. Sarah, too, found herself navigating uncharted territory. She was proud to see the kids' blossoming happiness when Leonard called or visited. Yet a cautious distance remained between her and Leonard. They spoke more civilly, occasionally sharing a laugh over something funny Sophie or Brandon did, but they never ventured into romantic terrain. The trust once shattered would not be easily rebuilt. One crisp Saturday morning, Sarah and Leonard took the kids apple picking at an orchard halfway between Boston and New York. The orchard's rolling hills, dotted with autumn leaves, offered a picturesque setting. As they wandered through the trees, collecting plump red apples, the family dynamic felt almost normal. Sophie teased Brandon about how many apples he could carry. Leonard pretended to measure them for size, and Sarah rolled her eyes at their goofy banter while secretly smiling. Later, as they gathered around a wooden picnic table to enjoy fresh apple cider, Sarah found herself reflecting on the long, painful road that led them here. She felt no illusions that everything was magically fixed. The scars of betrayal lingered, and they still lived in separate worlds. Yet, the children had gained a father willing to fight for them. That mattered more than the glittering illusions of the past. Before leaving the orchard, Leonard asked Sarah if he could have a word in private. They walked a short distance away from the kids. Leonard exhaled, meeting her gaze. "I know we can't go back to what we had, but I hope we can at least move forward. Co-parent as friends, maybe see where life takes us." Sarah studied him for a moment, the crisp autumn wind rustling her hair. She nodded, a faint but genuine smile on her lips. "Let's keep it simple and honest," she replied, "for the kids and for us." One step at a time, they rejoined Sophie and Brandon, who were laughing over a silly apple cider commercial they'd heard. Together, they loaded the car with their bags of apples, the orchard behind them glowing in the late afternoon sun. On the ride home, the kids dozed off, tired from the day's excitement. Sarah caught Leonard's eye in the rearview mirror, and he offered a small grin. For the first time, the future felt hopeful. The cheating millionaire husband, who once shattered his family, had confronted the cost of his actions. Now, as he strove to rebuild connections with tears and honest effort, he realized that real wealth lay not in bank accounts or boardrooms, but in the love and forgiveness nurtured around him, one steady, faithful moment at a time. True forgiveness often blooms from the deepest wounds, and Leonard Chambers's journey proves that no amount of money can repair a broken family overnight. Betrayed yet determined to protect her children, Sarah carved a new life in Boston, never imagining that her ex-husband would one day return with genuine remorse. Yet it was through steady commitment, weekend visits, long overdue apologies, and the courage to sacrifice professional ambition that Leonard discovered a richer bond than any business deal could offer. Sophie and Brandon, once left behind, blossomed under a father's renewed devotion, while Sarah cautiously opened her heart to the possibility of shared parenting. If you found yourself moved by this story of heartbreak, transformation, and the power of second chances, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support encourages us to bring more emotional, thought-provoking tales that remind us sometimes the hardest step is the one toward redemption, and it's never too late to take it.